Director of Medtech Innovator Asia Pacific.
Great, thank you, Bernice, and a very good morning, everyone, and good evening to those of you joining us from the US. I know we have people joining us quite early in the morning as well. The US, we have people joining us quite early in the morning as well. Okay, there's a bit of an echo here in the background. Let's see if people joining us quite early in the morning. If we can ask everyone to mute themselves if you're not speaking, that would be wonderful. Thank you so much. My name is Frederick Nabig. I'm the Managing Director for Medtech Innovator based here in Singapore. This is the fourth webinar in our series, and today's topic is US and versus Asia Pacific regulatory strategy. And we have an outstanding panel joining us today, and I'll come to them in just a second. Just a reminder for those of you watching on our live stream on YouTube or on LinkedIn, we do host these sessions every Thursday, 10 o'clock a.m. Singapore time, you'll be able to access all of these on the Medtech Innovator YouTube channel. Next week, I believe our topic is health economics and working with payers, so don't miss that one. For those of you who may not be familiar with Medtech Innovator, very briefly, we are the world's largest accelerator for startups in medical devices, digital health, and in vitro diagnostics. We do give away 300,000 in cash and other non-dilutive awards at the end of the program. We have globally well over 600 startups that have gone through our accelerator program, and those companies have gone on to raise $7 billion in follow-on equity funding. You will have a chance to meet all of the 24 companies that are in the Medtech Innovator Asia Pacific cohort this year if you join us at the APAC Medtech Forum here in Singapore on the 5th and 6th of December. Do watch our social media feed for more information about that. And if you have an interest to get in touch with us and be part of our ecosystem, please let us know. Quick comment on logistics for our cohort who are online and you are familiar with the with how this works. You are welcome to ask your questions either using the chat function at the bottom of your screen or put up your hand, and we will give you the opportunity to ask your questions. The Q&A session begins after 1 hour, and we will ask our panelists to stay on, of course, to join us for that. Now, I'm delighted to introduce to you our two regulatory experts on the panel today. Representing Asia Pacific, I'm thrilled to welcome back Myang Tanakasamsob, Head of Regulatory Affairs for Asia Pacific at Johnson & Johnson Vision. Myang will introduce herself in just a moment. I've known Myang for many years. She is also the chair of the APAC Med Regulatory Affairs Committee and has done a lot of really solid policy work across APAC for many, many years. And joining us from the US, from North Carolina, I'm delighted to introduce to you Rob McCuspy. Welcome, Rob. Rob is Regulatory Affairs Manager at Proxima Clinical Research, and he'll introduce himself in just a moment as well. So first question then to our panelists, and I'll begin with the ladies. So I'll ask Myang to introduce herself first. Tell us a bit about yourself, about your role and about your company. And maybe tell us if you have done any work with a startup community over your long career in regulatory affairs. Yeah.
Thank you, Frederick. Yes, nice to meet everyone. Definitely, I've been in this area like longer than 25 years. Been to, I think J&J Vision would be my 9th MNC that I used to work with. So definitely in this area, RAQA, medical affairs, clinical affairs, in this area all these times, and did a lot of policy work. In addition to APAC Med, I'm also in the Global Harmonization Working Party, TC Technical Committee Vice Chair, and this year, this term in particular, the chair is from NMPA China. So that's a good interaction.
Excellent.
And the experience with the startup, I'm doing the volunteer work in APAC Med to give some advice to the startup. For myself, I think only one startup that I used to work for would be Actilian when I used to work in Sydney. I used to work in Australia. Originally came from Thailand, but I moved to Australia and then later on Hong Kong, and now in Singapore for 8 years now. So the startup, the smallest firm that I used to work with would be Actilian. Being to J&J, this is the second time I was in Medtech. Earlier, definitely multiple companies, including Boston Scientific, Zimmer Biomet, Bausch & Lomb, Alcon. Yeah, so now I'm back to J&J on the vision role to head up the regulatory affairs team across Asia Pacific. Yeah.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Myung. We're delighted to have you on the panel. And Rob, tell us a bit about Proxima, about yourself, and how Proxima typically engages with startups.
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually started my career as a PhD bench chemist in the U.S. National Lab System before brief stint in academia, and then transitioning to the medical device industry for the last 8 years. First started out working with small businesses and startups, helping them commercialize their first medical device products, a lot of class 2 products. And in addition to getting exposed to all of the hats that you wear in the startup world, kept getting drawn to regulatory and quality and leading those areas. So eventually found Proxima, which is a startup itself, now turning about 5. And I was able to really scale my efforts because Proxima really likes working with companies as a partner and as an extension of their team. And so that really helps in the startup community where folks may need to dial up and dial down the hours that they spend on staff and resources. So we're really excited to work with a wide variety of startups to help them commercialize their technologies. And we've helped several companies with de novos and 510Ks and numerous pre-subs with US FDA interactions. So
very good. We'll come to all of those topics in just a moment. And staying with you for a second, Rob, what question we get very often is how early should a startup really begin thinking about its regulatory strategy, and when should a startup think about looking to outside help, working with maybe a third-party expert for regulatory advice? What's your experience there, and what's your advice?
Yeah, our experience is that engaging early is really beneficial, and engaging early to just do an initial assessment or an early strategy is really the most beneficial. And so understanding how regulatory will be part of the success of the startup. So what is it, not just from the engineering perspective, what is the clinical need that it's solving? Not just the reimbursement landscape, but how will the regulatory process influence the time to market, and what are the various go-to-market strategies for that? And so sometimes different pathways may have different advantages. So we really suggest engaging early because it helps. We found that it helps CEOs manage that timeline of how fast they can get to market and maybe making some decisions about in their product pipeline what they may want to prioritize.
Got it. And Myung, you worked across a number of multinationals in your career. If we talk about pitfalls and some challenges that one can come across as you are trying to get regulatory approval in major markets in Asia Pacific, what are some of the challenges that you've come across from an MNC perspective, and that you would maybe want to flag for a startup to watch out for as potential pitfalls as you're planning your regulatory strategy and pathways?
Definitely a lot of challenges, but I think one of the most common that we have would be Asia-Pac not being included early enough, and we started legislation in Asia-Pac just too late. Because it's always common pattern, US, EU, and the rest of the world probably would be, if I get luxury, would be Japan together with US and EU. But some of these startup, like when I was in Actelion, even as a pharma company, I think pharma startup a bit more advanced because they have to do multiple phases of clinical trial. So they have the global IA strategies, right? When you develop the clinical strategies, you incorporating what China need. Do you need to have the site in China? Do you need to have Chinese data? Or what would be the Japanese data? However, in MedTech, it's in the past, we got the luxury that EU timeline, EU MDR, back then EU MD is quite short. So we managed to be able to come to the rest of the world faster. But now, the challenges that they have is we not start early enough, and we could because we have multiple development in our region. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And Rob, what are the common pitfalls that you see when you work directly with startups for the US market?
Yeah, I think one of the common pitfalls we see is people making a choice to design a product around the regulatory strategy instead of designing the regulatory strategy around the product. Some people will be inclined to say, well, maybe I can change the design of my device so it might be an easier regulatory pathway, but that might lose some of the innovation behind it, or it might lose some of the competitive advantages, and in some cases, even the reason for being in the product. And so really what we try to encourage folks is to look at the product first and then tailor the regulatory strategy to bringing that product to market most effectively.
Right. That's helpful. Let's talk a little bit about classification as well as approval process and timelines. Now, just for the audience here, what we did at the beginning of our accelerator was we surveyed our cohort companies and had them provide some questions in terms of challenges that they had in particular areas. So some of these questions are not necessarily from me; they are paraphrased questions from our cohort companies. And I'll turn to Myung first on device classification in Asia Pacific. I know there are some differences in terminology between HSA and in Singapore and other markets and so on. And there was a question specifically related to China in terms of what are the guidelines and factors that determine classification, whether a product in China should be a class 2 or a class 3. Do you want to comment on that briefly from an Asia Pacific perspective?
Yes, definitely. I think in Asia Pacific, we have at least a luxury for Southeast Asian market that even that still have some differences, but the classification is go by AMDD or ASEAN Medical Device Directive, that they have the rules similarly to the EU. So in that case, you will be able to go to almost all the market, pretty much a similar classification. However, it's not 100%. They understand the differences, but because of the G2G, government to government, so they have a lot of meetings, discussion. However, the rest of the region quite different because we don't have harmonization yet. The simplest one would be Australia. Australia pretty much based on EU, so you can figure out what EU classification, but there still be some outlier products that it might be upper class in EU and lower class in Australia or vice versa. And in China in particular, I think it's by listing. The reason when I said by listing is mean they have the list of the devices classified class 1, class 2, class 3, and a lot of times it's not aligned with EU, not aligned with the US. They have their own classification. Let's say, let me make example, contact lens worldwide, nobody classify as class 3. But in China, contact lens classified as a class 3. Mm-hmm. So you just have to look at the list. And then with Korea, also is a listing. So basically you have to look at it, whether it's class 1 to 4. So in that case, you have to look at, they have the list, but both China and Korea, you can inquire them. There is a process of the classification, especially if you have combination products and you're not sure whether it's drug or devices, you definitely can submit to that. And for Taiwan, pretty much follow US. So it's class 1, 2, 3. If your product classify whatever classification in the US, pretty much would be in Taiwan. And Japan definitely, it's kind of similar to GSTF or European Europe, but it's 1, 2, 3, 4. However, still have slightly differences. Yeah. So,
Thanks. That's helpful. And we've been working many years on trying to get the degree of harmonization within Asia Pacific. I think the reality is it's still not quite there, and pathways are different, requirements are different, and even classification systems are different. And that's of course for companies, especially smaller companies that are working here in the region, something to keep in mind. Now things are a little bit easier and clearer in the US, Rob. So maybe tell us very, very briefly about the everyone's familiar with 510Ks, I think, but maybe the key differences between 510K, PMA, and de novo, and what's required for a de novo pathway, and are there benefits in following a de novo pathway versus a PMA, or do you need to have a PMA to get a de novo? How are they all related?
Yeah, great question. So PMA is for class 3, the highest risk class devices in the US. And so those, you can think about implantable devices and such. But for the lower risks in class 1 and class 2, if there is a substantially equivalent device on the market, a predicate device, then the 510K pathway is open. But for truly innovative products where the FDA may not have seen something like this before, the de novo pathway is a really great pathway for, they're usually class 2 devices, sometimes class 1. And it allows the opportunity to not just bring a new product to market and kind of set the standard of what the agency will look at in future devices that might be using your device as a predicate in their future submission. So it's a way to almost set the bar for the competition that they're going to have to jump over to enter the market. In terms of the level of difference in terms of testing, oftentimes the difference between a 510K and a de novo will be very minimal in terms of the testing, because FDA will have very similar questions of safety and similar questions of efficacy and want to see similar levels of testing to prove both. It really comes down to, is there something new about this device that FDA wants to see this additional information? And so that triggers the de novo pathway. And some companies find it really advantageous to have that designation from FDA that, yeah, this really is something new we haven't seen before.
It's interesting because what we sometimes see here in Asia Pacific is investors are a bit hesitant when a startup comes with and proposes a de novo regulatory pathway as opposed to a 510K, and will usually question that and thinking it's going to be many more years of time to market. Is that normally the case, or what are time differences there roughly in terms of approval timelines?
Yeah, in terms of the review time, it's on the order of, say, 90 days for the 510K and on the order of, say, 120 days for the de novo. Those can vary. There's always the opportunity for the FDA to ask for additional information and kind of pause that clock during the review process. So, but in terms of the testing that's required, again, the burden really depends on the design of the device and ensuring that safety and efficacy. So whether there is already a device on the market that is similar and provided a pathway of here's the types of testing FDA is looking for, or whether it is something new that would be required, the device's intended use is still going to trigger that same level of testing. So oftentimes what we'll see is maybe a device might fit within 2 product codes. There might be a way sometimes to do a 510K and combine 2 predicates, have it be having 2 product codes. Other times that's not possible and it needs to go the de novo pathway. We don't see a huge difference in the level of testing required and the time to market in both of those scenarios. There is a difference in the user fee, the submission fee for the submissions, but compared to the testing, it's not as significant as the time to develop it.
Right. Now, I wanted to talk a bit about getting feedback from regulatory agencies, both in APAC as well as in the US. Now, I know in the US you have the possibility to reach out to the US FDA and have a pre-sub or pre-submission meeting. Are these? Do you feel that these? Maybe explain a little bit about what they are, and how can a non-US startup use these? Are they open for any company anywhere in the world? And is there any particular information that a startup needs to gather and collect, whether clinical data or any other evidence, before they get into that first pre-sub conversation with the FDA?
Yeah, so the pre-sub is open to anyone anywhere in the world who wishes to market a device in the US. And so any company anywhere in the world is able to have meetings. We represent a lot of international clients for their pre-subs. In terms of what's required, a detailed description of the device, and then any information that you can provide the agency will give the opportunity for better feedback from the agency. The more specificity you can provide, the better. Oftentimes, if a company is unsure of what are the testing requirements for a given device, we can present a testing plan and ask for feedback from the agency. And so it can de-risk the overall testing plan. We often see that with clinical trials as well, when those are required, because it will help de-risk the investment in a clinical trial, making sure the endpoints are appropriate, the right number of subjects and sites, and they can offer feedback as well, statistical analysis and so forth. So it's a very beneficial process, and we also recommend it for newer devices because it gives the agency and the review teams a chance to become familiar with the device and how they might regulate this newer technology. We think that working in that way with the agency tends to form a more constructive and collaborative relationship than simply going straight to the agency, not having had any interactions, and filing a 510K or a de novo, because there's a risk that they may ask for testing that may not be possible to execute during that 180-day clock when it's paused. So it really de-risks the process to have an early pre-submission meeting.
Very good, very good. Great takeaway there. And Myung, for Asia Pacific, what are there similar ways of getting feedback directly from the regulatory authorities around the region? Something similar to an FDA pre-sub, or are some countries more open than others to have that conversation?
Yes, there's would be something that we would love to do it before our submission, especially for the more complex markets. In Japan, definitely they have like a permanent pathway with the formal, informal. You can pay for it and you can talk with them. They have a binding and non-binding, right? However, it might not be straightforward like with FDA. Like in Japan, they might not give you an answer, and the answer that they answer might not be what you ask. So sometimes it's not straightforward. However, that's a way to engage them. Australia, there is a pathway to engage them. You need to apply 1 month in advance. If you have but more and more markets today, they try to develop innovative device pathway, similarly to the breakthrough device in the US or de novo. So in that case, you will be able to have the additional channel to talk with them. Like in Singapore, you will be able to organize a meeting. Korea can organize a meeting. If you want to go to the innovative pathway, primary would be local devices, not overseas. And also you can organize a meeting with them, but that would be pretty much non-binding, no minutes, and it's free of charge, but it's good to do it. However, I heard that some of the company have difficulties to fix a meeting. So I think it's go down to some certain relationship company by company. For the rest of the market, like Taiwan FDA doesn't have the formalized process. So it depends how much you know them and you try to organize it, but you still be able to meet. China, you have to go for super informal one if you want. Okay, there will be the formal pathway if you will be able to be qualified to Green Channel. Green Channel is fast track innovative. If you be able to qualify for Green Channel, so it means that it's kind of the breakthrough designation in the US. So you would be able to have the reviewer to be your buddy throughout the process. You can do formal pre-consultation meeting. However, with the Green Channel, it doesn't mean that you get approval faster, but you get clearer requirements, because it's proven that like when we have submission head-to-head to our competitors, and our competitors went to Green Channel, we got approval faster. But it depends on what the marketing strategy. Sometimes it's good to have a Green Channel designation. However, with the VBP, it's not clear yet what the benefits. So, and then if you don't have Green Channel, another pathway to be able to meet them, and this one is out from the oven. If you have the study in Hainan Boao, definitely a lot of money investment, $1 million of course, you would be able to have the benefit to have the meeting with them. However, that's still unclear. It's just announced like in August. None of the companies will be able to meet them face to face yet. For the rest, it's really hard to meet them, even organize training, giving the overview. They just recently just have audits again at the CMDE. They're super careful to meet with the industry. So only one way, you have to go for the public day and then have a lot of people around you to talk about your products. That's not the way that I like to do it. I went there and then for me, I couldn't understand Chinese. Then I look at some of the faces. Are they working for competitors? How can they stand behind me while we are talking about our products? So yeah, but now also in China, they move it, but because of COVID, to online or by emails as well. But by email, it depends on what you ask. Because if you go yes or no question, you might get always no answer. And then another thing is the answer might not be applicable to your products, because in China is no binding, and it's like individual opinion. The regulators might have one opinion. It doesn't mean that it's applied to others. Yeah, it's not straightforward.
Not straightforward, which is usually the answer we get when we talk about Asia Pacific. Very helpful, Myang. So in terms of fast tracking, you mentioned, of course, the Green Channel in China. Is the Green Channel generally open to overseas companies and startups as well as local companies? And is that pathway or the requirements or to be eligible for the Green Channel, are the requirements different if you are a local Chinese company versus an overseas company?
I would say that Green Channel is open for everyone, overseas or local. You have to be able to figure it out why your devices are innovative. It's a 2 months approval process, right? So first requirement, you need to have Chinese patents, and if you don't have Chinese patent, you couldn't start. And then you would
so that's a minimum requirement. You need to have a patent filed or approved in China.
Yeah, correct. And then you go to the process and then have a meeting with them, but they will not tell you why you get approval or not approval. So it depends on how you justify. I experienced it before. We got breakthrough designation in the US, but we might not get Green Channel approval. And it's not clear with their answer why we not get it, because a lot of legal words that we still cannot figure it out why we don't get it. But after you get rejected, you still can refile again.
Oh, you can. Okay. Okay.
It means that you just have to go to look at what you put together last time. It might not be appealing enough. So
Very, very, very helpful. So you mentioned breakthrough designation in the US, and of course that's the equivalent that we'll have Rob talk about here in a moment. So tell us a bit about that, and what are the benefits of breakthrough designation, and how does a company know if they're eligible to apply for breakthrough designation? Rob.
Sure. So the breakthrough designation program has two specific criterion that need to be met. One is that it's a life-saving device, or it's treating a permanently debilitating condition. And the second is it has to meet one of 4 sub-requirements. And so it has to be either very new and innovative, where there's no currently available technologies, or it has to be a significant improvement over the existing technologies, or it has to be something that is beneficial from a public health perspective. From the U.S. perspective. And so one of the advantages of that program, aside from it sounds flashy to investors, is that you get increased access to the review teams. So you can have what they call sprint discussions, where you get to have a focused meeting on a single topic, and you get to have a much faster turnaround time than a traditional pre-submission meeting. That's also dependent on the agency's bandwidth and the review team's bandwidth. But you will be paired with a review team through that process. And so you will get some really good insights and increased access. And then they do prioritize the review of the marketing submission when you get to that stage as well.
And in terms of timelines, if you get breakthrough designation, that speed things up significantly? Typically?
Yeah, it can speed things up because instead of a traditional pre-submission meeting, which can typically take about 75 days in many cases between when you submit it to the agency and you get your meeting, you can sometimes get meetings within 45 days or less with the sprint discussions, and then you can again turn around and have multiple interactions more frequently to get more information from the agency. And in terms of prioritizing the review, we haven't seen huge significant impacts on the actual marketing submission side. But one of the interesting things about the breakthrough device process in the US is that within 60 days of applying for the breakthrough designation, you will get written feedback from the agency. So whether you are approved, which is the best case scenario, or if they say, no, we would like to see additional information or additional test data, they'll cite certain deficiencies that they would like to see for a future breakthrough designation if they believe it could be eligible in the future. So that can also provide some insights about the review teams thinking, maybe not everything for a marketing submission, but at least some of their initial questions.
Got it. Thanks for that. Myung, I wanted to just have your perspective on approval timelines in general across Asia Pacific. Where are the shortest approval timelines? Where are the longest? I remember it was at one point in time, Japan was very long, and they managed to speed up, and China was long, and they managed to speed up as well. What's the latest status on timelines? And one of the questions here from our cohort, one of our cohort companies, is where is the approval timeline shorter? China NMPA or US FDA? And it's a bit of a difficult question. It's a bit like asking how long is a piece of string. But Myung, maybe you can just share with us your views on approval timelines in general, putting aside the fast track options.
I would say that it really depends.
Yeah.
It depends who you work with. I had the luxury to work with so many talents, and some of the talents incredible competence. Like we got implantable devices approval in Korea 2 months, and my ex-boss came to talk to me. It's some of the electrical equipment that's a lower class for aesthetic, and they took 2 years to be approval in Korea.
So the difference there, sorry to interrupt you. So that what you're saying is that the difference there is the caliber and the competence of your in-house regulatory
Correct.
staff.
Yes, and relationship with the regulators.
Right.
So that's another thing is your data set as well.
Yeah.
If company incorporating APAC key markets requirements during the development, or we call V&V, verification and validation, and that's that, or even the clinical requirements. So it's going to be faster. Like sometimes you will be able to even discuss with the regulators to develop pathway as well. Like even Singapore, normally if you don't have US EU approval, Singapore would take at least 18 months to 24 months.
Yeah.
They Vision got it 6 months. So it depends how you approach it, what your strategy. Japan, yes or no? Once they're faster when I was in Zimmer Biomed, but now they get long again. So it depends on the product categories and what they're concerned. China become more predictable, I would say. The short, you can go as short as even lower than 18 months, including type testing. It depends on what your strategy and what your data set. So it depends on the data set, depends on your caliber of your talents in the market. And unfortunately, startup might not have the luxury to be able to hire your own people like MNC. Relationship with the regulators is based on your CRO. So probably you have to choose the right CRO to work with. I made so many mistakes in my career to work with not so good CRO. So that's why sometimes the progression not there. And like when I was in Sydney, when I used to work for Cochlear, one of the China CRO, when we try to cut costs, so they assign someone who cannot speak Chinese to work with me. That just won't work. And I look Chinese, but I can't speak Chinese, so the communication is not there. So basically, to work, you might have to do a bit more research to get the right CRO, what their credential, not only how much they charge you, because if you can get approval shorter, you can sell in the market faster, right? Like my ex-boss took 2 years and probably by now still not get approval. She got so frustrated with Korea. I told her we never have problem with Korea. Similarly, Taiwan, you always get problem if you don't get the right one.
And interesting. Myung, a question we get very often is from startups is in Asia Pacific to get approval in APAC, in major markets in APAC, does it help? And if so, how does it help? If you already have CE mark, or if you already have, or EU MDR, or if you have US FDA approval, is that going to help you get approval in major markets here in APAC faster?
Yes, that's a really good question. And that's what something that I try to work on it. And hopefully I will be able to make it happen before my retirement. So first of all, in the past, most of the majority of the market private, either US or EU. But if you look at today, like Korea, Japan, you don't need US or EU. You can file at the same time as a US and EU. Depends on the product classification. And then when you look at the rest of the region, probably China still need country of origin approval, but I know that they talk about it. And with the learning curve so far, I wouldn't be surprised in the next few years, even because when they move so quickly because it's pretty much top down in China. They might waive US and EU prerequisite requirements. And then another one is Singapore, that you will be able to go for the full conformity assessment. So US and EU requirements became less and less important because now Singapore approval became more powerful with the work of APAC Med. I'm not sure whether you guys are aware of the Red Reliance pathway that we just. This is not invented by industry, is initiated by the WHO. So APAC Med working with the WHO now to drive, and we have the great success over COVID period with China and Thailand. So now after you get Singapore approval, you will be able to go to Thailand with the Red Reliance, and it takes only 1 month approval, 1 or 2 months. So you just choose to drop down, get a consent form done. And then another market like Philippines now recognize Singapore as well. So, and then actually Philippines recognize all the ASEAN market. And we in the process to talk with Laos regulator. The reason why we tackle all this small market, because small market, we don't have people. So that's why we have to make it simpler. So Laos going to have the alliance model with Singapore and Thailand.
Makes
so
sense.
That in the future. And then like Australia today also recognize Singapore, and Vietnam also recognize Singapore. So this means that US, if we can make Singapore approval become shorter and shorter, we will be able to use Singapore instead of US and EU that more expensive. And that's and then Malaysia and Singapore are also talking about mutual recognition. Like yesterday, I was in Indonesia to introduce Reliance to MOH. Probably they might consider post-market rather than pre-market or pre-market for SAMD devices. So something like that. So a lot of development to elevate the status of Singapore approval. So that's why when I spoke with one of the startup in Singapore, and they try to raise funds and get US and EU approval, I asked them why. You just get your whole country approved. You can go to multiple Southeast Asia market and then get momentum there, get money, gain experience, and then go broader. Yeah.
That's a great point, because it's a question we get very often, especially if companies based in Southeast Asia or based in Singapore. Does it make sense to just go for HSA approval first? And from what you're saying is definitely that's clearly an option. Very helpful, Myung. Appreciate that. Rob, there was a question that we get here from time to time about the 510K process that I wanted just to check in with you on. It's this whole concept of substantial equivalence and the challenge that startups have to grapple with, because on the one hand, you have to show substantial, if I understand correctly, and I'm not an expert, you have to show substantial equivalence, and you need to find a predicate device and show how similar you are to something which is already on the market if you're going for the 510K pathway. But yet at the same time, you want to promote this as your technology is something that is new and unique and different from everyone else. How does a startup balance that? And what are some of the approaches that you see from Proxima's perspective?
Yeah, so we really try to look at what is the intended use of the device for the subject device and the potential predicate, and then what is the technological similarity or difference, and we need to have alignment in the intended use. So if the intended use is completely novel, then it's almost impossible to find substantial equivalence. But say the intended use is to make a surgical incision. You know, if you have a brand new technology like a laser cutter as opposed to a traditional scalpel, there's a different technology there. So there's different questions of safety and efficacy that would be raised. And so it would be, again, almost impossible to demonstrate substantial equivalence in those cases. So it really comes down to understanding what is available in the market that has been granted a de novo or already has a 510K clearance. And understanding how to position that device as not providing different questions of safety and efficacy. And so oftentimes, this is where we also recommend a pre-submission meeting to get the agencies thinking on, do they agree that there is substantial equivalence? Because if it's questionable, it's much better to find out in the early stages and prepare for a de novo submission than to say, okay, we're gonna try to do a 510K. Again, the questions may not be significantly different in what it ultimately requires the testing to be, but it can save time from filing a 510K, getting a determination from the agency it's not substantially equivalent, and then turning around and now having to file a de novo anyway. Knowing that up front can help prepare for that.
Very, very helpful. Very helpful. A quick reminder to our cohort companies: feel free to queue up your questions in the Q&A in the Q&A, using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to those at the end of our session. I want to talk briefly about clinical data and what's required there. And Rob, maybe I'll just stay with you for a second. What for a startup in medtech that is based outside of the US, when do they need to start to think about doing clinical trials in the US? And for what device classes, for what reasons, and how, if they're working on collecting data, clinical data outside the US, how can they ensure that that data will ultimately be accepted by the US FDA? Or are there always other cases when they will always insist on having trials done on US soil, and if so, why?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the first thing we do is we look at the 510K for the predicate, assuming that there is one, and see, did they require a clinical trial, and what was the type of design of that trial. And in those cases, you have a pretty good sense of what would be required. The FDA will be very interested in understanding, if a trial is conducted outside of the US, how will the results be directly transferable to the US population? So they will obviously ask questions about age, gender, ethnicity distributions, clinical presentation distributions that might vary from an outside of the US site to a US site. They might also ask questions about what's the standard of care where the trial is being conducted if it's outside of the US. It can also sometimes lead to some usability questions of, would the training in a different country than the US lead people to use the device differently? So it can raise a whole host of questions. FDA strongly recommends having a pre-submission meeting if companies want to consider an outside of the US approach for their clinical trials. And we agree with that, because the justifications become key in being able to use that OUS data to support the submission.
Clear, very helpful. Thanks for that. And Myung, what's the situation now in Asia Pacific in terms of regulatory agencies starting to accept foreign reference data and foreign clinical data? Are there still regulatory agencies here that insist on having clinical trials done locally in their own country in order to consider any approvals?
I think now the CR pathway being kind of accepted because a lot of education along that line. And having said that, some of the high-risk devices, I still see the requirements of the clinical study for the subject devices. Everything is based on your justification, and some of the market have the predicate devices concept like China, Korea, Japan. So how you compare yourself with your predicate devices, what the differences, do you have enough publication or any previous data to support? It's an art, but no straight answer. It's not like one fit for all, but some of the products might be quite unfortunate, like cochlear implant, China, and MPA, CMDE consider that because now they understand more with the genetic differences. If you deal with them like 10 years ago, like I have to go to justify how Chinese eye is different from even with the Indian eyes or Malaysian eyes, right? So they feel that definitely Caucasian eyes is out different, but they say they're more accepted. But unfortunately, let's say cochlear implant, they still consider that because Chinese language have intonation, full intonation, and that need to be proven because with the English is not exactly the same. So that's why some of the companies require local clinical trial, but it's not common. And then they also understand the concept of conditional approval. I managed to get some devices approval under conditional pathway, so you can do PMS. Even with Japan, they also have that kind of concept. So rather try to prove everything only pre-market we will be able to collect more data during post-market.
Understood. That's very helpful. Thank you for that. Now we have less than 10 minutes left, and one of the things that I did want to touch on are some of the new developments on the regulatory front, and some new acronyms that, well, they're not that new, but relatively recently introduced new classifications and acronyms that I think many of our startups have come across. MDSAP is one of those, and maybe Myung, you can tell us a little bit about so this is the Medical Device Single Audit Program. What does a medtech startup need to know about MDSAP? Why is it important?
This is kind of like caught me by surprise with this development. It's so fast and it's so good. So in the past, can you imagine, like when you run your factory, you have to get how many agencies audit you? Even today, some of the agencies like Korea or Taiwan, in certain extent China, they still do some certain audits. However, with the MDSAP members today, so when the auditor from CAP go to audit you, you can require, you want to get MDSAP certificate. MDSAP certificate is mean that you cover US requirements, EU, TGA, all the I think it's Brazil as well. There are a whole bunch of some of the members from IMDRF in the MDSAP, not all. And with that, we don't need to get second audit, right? So it means that in the US, you don't need to get FDA audit again. In EU, you don't need to get another audit. Australia, you not need, TGA doesn't do audits because it's under MDSAP. Korea in the process, considering with the KGMP, there's a unique requirements in Korea to accept MDSAP. So they are working on that one. But Taiwan still have their own QSD. China accepted MDSAP certificate. However, some of the products, if they would like to audit, they still have the right to audit. So, right. But MDSAP definitely is a quality system. It's based on ISO 13485. However, there would be additional aspect from the MDSAP member, like US might have additional requirements, or Australia have additional requirements. So they're incorporating that into their audit. It's brilliant. It's super good. I'm looking for the day that we're gonna have single review with the legislation.
That would be nice. That would be nice. So I think. Thanks, Myung. So I think for a startup, it's important. If you're doing manufacturing in-house, you need to know what MDSAP is. If you're outsourcing it to a contract manufacturer, it helps to understand if they have if they're compliant, I guess, to the MDSAP program. Rob, I wanted to ask you briefly another concept here that many of our companies are working on is software as a medical device. And what exactly is software as a medical device? And does it differ from what's sometimes referred to as clinical decision support software? And how does the FDA view those concepts?
Yeah, that's a great question. So at the highest level, software as a medical device means that there is essentially no hardware in order for the device to perform its functions. This might be something where you might see an app on a person's smartphone, and it's providing a therapy for the person, or it might be collecting data to help support decision making by a physician and gathering data that couldn't be gathered otherwise. And so in order to support a diagnosis. So there's a lot of different opportunities that exist within the SAMD space, and a lot of the regulations that we're seeing related to SAMDs are similar to what we've seen for software in a medical device, where it combines software and hardware. The FDA has its own guidance about clinical decision support software. I don't think we have time to unpack all of it, but they do have specific guidance for what the enforcement discretion looks like there. And so it's very specific for what will fall within that. Most of the time, in order to achieve the full functionality that's desired, we're seeing clients choose to go the SAMD and traditional device pathways.
Understood. Thanks for that. And before we wrap up, I also wanted to just touch briefly on the latest development or developing guidelines in the area of artificial intelligence and AI. And I know that here in APAC, South Korea, Australia have usually typically taken the lead on AI and AI related medical technologies, and US FDA appears to be taking the lead on that globally. What are the latest developments that you see on AI guidelines and approvals and pathways in Asia Pacific, Miang?
Oh, that's a really good question, because some these become the big challenges across the region. A lot of regulators have some challenges because this is new and it's a rapid development. All kind of things come to them, including application and so on. So I would say that in some the area, the most development now, Korea definitely is in the leading role, would be on the cybersecurity. You hear a lot more on cybersecurity requirement from Korea, now with China, Australia talking about it. So more and more market. Singapore still, Singapore acknowledge that is new to them. So they have kind of immediate approval pathway. If you get approval from some certain agency, that's nice to give them some time to develop themselves. And definitely this is not clear regulation in all markets yet. Like Indonesia doesn't have software regulation. India not regulate software at the moment because they feel that something that is new to them.
Right.
So we still enjoy some of the market when we do software changes, and some of the market leading the role, like Korea and China, and also Singapore with cybersecurity. So you can't ignore that. And that's a new area, how our R&D would be able to incorporate all these requirements upfront. Because we have the situation also, even in J&J, product almost ready out to the door, but we still not meet cybersecurity requirements, and we have to do backward. That take longer.
Good point. And Rob, from US FDA perspective, latest guidelines, developments on either cybersecurity or AI, and are there any resources that maybe a startup can tap on that's freely available from the US FDA to learn more about this?
Yeah, the one great resource is the Good Machine Learning Practices document that the FDA has issued on their website. It's a fairly high-level document, but it does provide insights for what the agency will be looking for in the marketing submissions. It's fairly intuitive with what they're asking for. They also have recently launched the predetermined change control plan, which is especially useful for AI software. If it's known that, say, there's an initial training data set, and then as the device is marketed, they will retrain the data as more data sets become available, retrain the algorithm, then there's a process now that traditionally would have required a second 510K submission before you can launch that new version. You can now get a predetermined change control plan approved with your 510K and not have to do a second follow-on 510K submission. So it's less work for the agency, less work for the companies, and it's really new, and the agency is still wrapping their arms around how specifically they want to implement it. But it is a great development because it's some clear guidance of how to approach that.
Absolutely, that's a great point, and certainly an excellent development. I think that will be warmly welcomed by many in the industry. We are at the top of the hour here, so I wanted to extend my thanks to the panelists. But before we part ways, I'll ask each of them to say a few, share a few final words, tips, advice, anything else that maybe we haven't covered to our startup audience. And Miang, maybe I'll start with you.
Yes, I would like to reiterate again how early that you have to think about IA strategies globally, not only the US and EU. And please make sure that if you're gonna hire a professional, hire the good one, or work with the right CRO. That's really important. I'm pretty sure that you would learn by now. Nothing straightforward in APAC. But that's the beauty of it, right? Everything possible here, but you need to have the right strategy, and you have to have the right network with the regulators.
Great point. Thanks for that. And Rob, last thoughts.
Yeah, I will echo a previous suggestion about making sure that the reason for being for the device stays true, and to make sure that the regulatory strategy is supporting that device rather than compromising on the device to find an easier regulatory pathway.
Very good. Great advice. And would it be all right for our cohort companies to contact you if they have any follow-up questions? Is it okay if we share your contact details? We'll do that then separately. Well, don't hang up, Robin and Myung. Please stay on for the Q&A. We'll end our live stream here. Thank you to our YouTube and LinkedIn live audience. And